We've got an archive at work, and the archive collects information on people, places and organisations in Casey, Cardinia, and there was a file on Jessie Traill. So, and that's what got me onto it. So, and then I thought I'd write the story because we don't have, we don't have so many famous artists connected to this area, but she was one of them.
Interesting would be an understatement. My conversation with local historian Heather Arnold was more than interesting. It was fascinating and joyful and incredibly insightful. Heather Arnold has been working as the local librarian at Casey Cardinia Libraries for almost 2 decades now. She is full of passion for her local community and she absolutely loves history. I came across Heather through one of the 5 blogs that she writes. The blog is called Casey Cardinia Links to Our Past and was one of the first resources I came across in my research on Jessie's connection to Harkaway. The blog covers the post-colonial history of people, places, organisations and events in the city of Casey and Cardinia Shire. And on Thursday, the 14th of January 2016, Heather published an article on the life and works of Jessie Traill and the impact that she had on the local Harkaway community. I remember first reading the blog post and learning about Jessie and her 3 sisters and their life of travels and the way that she developed her art practice. And please go search for the blog on the internet. It's so easy to find and it's such a great resource to learn more about Jessie Traill and further dive into our local history. And it was in our conversation that Heather was able to share more knowledge that she had, not only on Jessie, but also on Jessie's sister, Elsie, who is such a huge contributor to feminist inclusion within the academic sphere. Heather just radiated enthusiasm as we spoke about Jessie and the history of Australia. From Jo Oliver's reading of Jessie's diary in our first episode, we're able to step into the first-hand accounts of Jessie's life and the formative experiences she had that give us insight into our global history. And now, through my conversation with Heather, and because of her expansive knowledge on the context within this historical society, I was able to gain a better understanding of what life might have been like for Jessie during the early 20th century, and indeed what life might have been like for other women during her time. And oh, how times have changed. Heather was so incredibly excited to share with me the knowledge that she had. And we jumped right in, with her telling me the things that first captured her attention about the life and works of Jessie Traill.
But there's a number of other aspects of her life which I found interesting. And the first one was religion. So I was interested to find that Jessie and her sister Elsie and the rest of the family were quite religious, and that was interesting. In fact, her two sisters, they went into an Anglican convent after their father died. Like, I didn't know there was an Anglican convent, but I mean, I just thought that was an amazing thing that they were so devout that they would do that. When clearly, after her parents died, the 4 sisters were left quite well off. So they could have really done anything with their life because they had the money behind them, but they chose to go into a convent. So I just thought that was really interesting. So I was sort of interested in the religious aspect of their life. And there was this quote that I have in my blog, which I'll just read out because I thought it was so wonderful. Where Bethia says of Jessie, her cousin, that she was deeply religious, selfless in her wants and ways. She is indeed the truest Christian I have ever known. And although she no longer works at her craft, those lovely hands, moving so expressively, so decisively, and so surely, are still as flexible and lissom as they were when she was a girl. So the other thing I liked about Jessie was that, she went and she became a nurse during the war. And I thought, a voluntary aid detachment. And, I've read a bit about other nurses, and it amazes me, that they just went off and they did. I mean, it's like all the men. They just decided to enlist for the good of their country, good of the community, whatever the reason was, patriotism, nationalism, just community. I don't know, but what a leap of faith it was to go across the other side of the world. They almost knew that if they went and volunteered, may not ever come back, especially the men. It wasn't so, most of the nurses returned. But, it was just this whole, I thought it was such a brave thing to do. Like, it would have opened their eyes up to go overseas. They never would hardly have left Victoria. And then all of a sudden, boom, they've gone to England, they've gone to Egypt, they've gone to, Gallipoli. I mean, there's lots of horrendous things, but there was this whole sense of travel and sense of adventure that they never would have got back home on the farm in Victoria. That always fascinates me, the way so many people willingly went overseas and had no idea really what they were getting into.
And that's such an interesting thing with Jessie as well, because she did have the financial supporting to not, like, she had every reason to stay. She could travel. If she wanted to go to Paris, which she had, or like overseas, she couldn't just have a fun time. But she decided to enlist and become a VAD. Like, oh my goodness.
And it said, I just read what it said, I found this on the State Library of Victoria website, the duties were numerous. It's what she had written in her diary. I think, like, it would have been hard work. Like, the poor girls are on their feet all day, and they had to, if you see photos of them in their white uniforms, you think, I don't know how they kept those clean and starched. But there was not only, it was all the hard work, and it was the uncertainty, and it was the fact, as you just said, that she didn't have to go. She could have stayed in Melbourne and had not a glamorous life, I mean, she could have got involved in the Red Cross like her sister did, like Elsie did. So she could have done all that and not gone overseas and served her country. And she didn't need to go overseas for the travel aspect, because she'd already been overseas quite a bit.
Jessie chose hard work. Jessie chose uncertainty. Jessie chose service. She didn't have to, but she did. This is the spirit of mateship that we so often attribute to the men and boys who left their homes to fight for our country. And of course, they exemplify this spirit and are so deserving of acknowledgement and thanks. But so too is Jessie, and all the women alongside her who served. There is a lot of similarities between the men and women who daringly left Australia to take part in the war efforts. And I think sometimes we forget to acknowledge the societal pressures that these women faced so intensely in the early 20th century. And it brings this new layer of understanding to what they were risking when they took this giant leap away from the normal societal conventions imposed upon them.
Oh, the other thing I thought about that, for some nurses, not for Jessie, that, was it a chance to escape the, stifling conventionality of their life? A lot of these women were in their 30s when they went, so not that, and they were unmarried, and not that they were on the shelf, but they probably were considered to be on the shelf.
That's the thing with society these days. Like, we can push it a lot further, quite frankly.
That's right,
but my grandparents, and to an extent my parents, like, wouldn't have thought of, it's a very different cultural life.
It's a different culture thing, yeah. So I remember my mother was married at 21. I mean, she was thinking, blimey, she wasn't married at 21.
Same with my mum. Yeah.
You just think, like 21's not old, but I mean, it's just, but yeah, so these were in their 30s. So for a lot of them, it was a chance to do something different, I guess. And it was also, I suppose, if they're not in Elsie's case, in Jessie's case, but if their brothers had enlisted, of course, it was a chance to sort of show that they could also serve overseas and do everything. But anyways, I just thought it was an interesting thing that she went overseas. I think in the pecking order, like they weren't the army nurses, so they were sort of the more menial ones. And for some of these women who are a bit middle class, it would have been interesting. But they still went and did their bit. So anyway, that's another thing I thought was interesting about Jessie, the whole fact that she decided to go overseas, and I thought, good on her. I just think it's a brave thing to do and a wonderful thing to do.
And you mentioned that you were so interested in Jessie as well as her sister Elsie. And was there similar stuff that you'd found about Elsie?
Elsie was another, there was the 4 sisters, and none of them married, well, 2 of them became nuns, but Elsie didn't marry either. And then she joined the Red Cross, and she spent a lot of her life working for the Red Cross, and she started the first Red Cross shop, where injured servicemen could sell their handiwork and women could sell their handiwork, and it was a form of income for them. So, and when she died, I saw her obituary, it said that she was noted for her Red Cross education work. I think, well, that's really nice. Sort of really nice that she was, clearly identified with the Red Cross and all the great work that the Red Cross did. And I just thought that was nice. And then she also left behind, she did a Bachelor of Arts at Melbourne University between 1895 and 1898. And she stayed at Janet Clark Hall, which is the Hall of Residence. And then she left £5,000 to them. Or not left, she gave them £5,000. And there's the E.M. Traill wing. So, that's another thing, like obviously an interest in, and how hard it was in those days for women to study at university. It's all right for young people. It's all right for even me, but like in those days, I think women weren't admitted to Melbourne University until things like something like 1880. So, and even in those first, when she was there in the 1890s, I mean, there must have been so few women there, and at least arts was probably more of a female, female degree, but like for girls who do medicine or something like that, it would have been a hard road for them, I think. So I think it's nice that, she benefited from education and she could afford it because of her family background, but she also tried to benefit other women as well by leaving money to them so they could actually stay, study at Janet Clark Hall.
So it's evident. Jessie and her sister made a profound impact through their work. But I wanted to ask Heather, from her own perspective, as a historian who understands how history has been written and constructed, why might someone as significant as Jessie Traill, a woman who has led an incredible life of service and created such beautiful works that tell us about our history and speak to our connections with locality, why might she, and others like her, be forgotten or under-acknowledged in the traditional art historical canon?
I always think about this, especially when we talk about women and opportunities and women in history. And we do think about other prominent artists in our area, such as like Arthur Boyd.
Yeah.
That kind of whole family. And the fact is, I'd heard about the Boyds a billion times over because I live in Harkaway.
Yeah.
The fact is, me hearing about Jessie Traill, I really had to go search. And so as a historian yourself, like, why do you think we do have less, I don't know whether it's research or attention or acknowledgement of women over their male counterparts?
Yeah, so was it because she was a woman and women's work is often undervalued? Because when you consider the value of craft compared to art, even though, like when you say like a patchwork quilt, like the original patchwork quilts, which are works of art, but they don't have the same value as art because it's done by women. I mean, I think it's partly because women's work was dismissed as more of a hobby than just something she did, especially their children, or just something they did between children. I think, so I don't know. I think it's more of a whole that women as a whole were underrepresented, like women writers, women artists, women anything were just underrepresented. It's not only women that are underrepresented, but when you look at the way history is written, people who are poor aren't written about, people who are, Indigenous people aren't written about. There's a whole raft of people who aren't written about, who are missing from history, because history was written mainly by white men. And I don't have anything against white men at all, and I think that that we shouldn't get rid of history, that what we need to do is add to history, which is what we're doing now. And I think that's what we need to do, filling in the gaps with all these missing stories. And I think that's why it's important that, you're doing this work, that the new books come out on Jessie Traill, that we're trying to fill the gaps in and to give a better whole, complete view of history, rather than just history is like white male artists, white male historians, white male this. And as I said, I have nothing against white males or any males at all. But, we just need to fill in the gaps. And that's what's so important these days.
Because the point is to not, as you said, we don't need to wipe out the version of history we have.
No.
The version of history that we have tells us something about the people who wrote it. Like,
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's important in that sense.
Yeah.
But we also have to understand that it's one road, and that there is a highway.
Yeah, that's right. There's many other paths that we should be taking, and that we can start doing that now.
This podcast has been narrated and produced by Grace Watson. Assistant producer Josiah Kopp. The theme music is Ottorino Respighi's Pines of Rome. And special thanks, of course, to our guest Heather Arnold.